Meeting for JSCB. I'm Councilor Bryn Lovejoy-Grinnell, and with me is Councilor Tim Rudd, Councilor Claude Bay, and Councilor Latoya Allen. We may be joined by others. Can I invite Suzanne and anyone else you'd like to bring with you? You can have a seat right on the edge there, on the side of the table.
Nobody else wants to come. You come.
Do you want to give us the warning? Like, some of the amounts are just budget, and we're not going to talk about the amounts. Can you give us the warning that you were talking about before, that we're not talking about certain numbers? What was the email?
So we are here today to talk about the amount that we're bonding for.
$108 million.
Right. This is the final phase of borrowing for JSCB Phase 3.
So all those are fixed and they've already been bid, right? Or there's still some that haven't.
So could we start, if you don't mind, Councilor, could we start with more of a broader summary of where we are in the scheme? This is Phase 2. Can we start with like a little bit of an overview for those people who haven't followed all the way through where we are here in the entire plan?
Sure.
Also note we've been joined by Councilor Driscoll.
So my slant is a little bit on the financial side, but what we've done in Phase 2 is we had 14 projects that we parsed over 4 different borrowings, which wasn't our initial plan. We had initially thought we would borrow all at once, but then realized that the scope and sequence of all these projects would be too great to undertake all of them at once. So they have been parsed out over the last several years in 4 borrowings. What we're looking to do in the coming months is do the final borrowing, which will include the last 7 projects.
Okay, so this is the 4th borrowing of 4
Yes.
expected for this phase.
Correct.
Okay, and so tell us more about these projects that are in this borrowing.
Okay, so for this borrowing, we have Clary and Danforth Middle Schools, the Expeditionary Learning Middle School, Fowler Field, and interior work on the building, as well as Henniger. So for Clary, it is primarily interior work with some exterior and entrance renovations to that school. We are in the discussion phases of possibly swinging those kids out of Clary to put them in one of the vacant schools during the renovation project to help expedite getting renovations done quickly.
Which one would be the closest school for that?
That one would be
We would be
Levy,
using,
right?
we would be using the Levy building.
Can I just ask you use the microphone closer, and then
Yes.
if you could both introduce yourselves also, just
I'm
for the
Dean DeSantis,
YouTube.
I'm the Chief Operations Officer.
Thank you.
So we would be using the Levy building. If we took the children out of Clary, they would go over to Levy for approximately 1 year, 1 school year.
So that's, of course, on the opposite side of the city. So the busing and walkers, like how would that play out?
It affects about 60 children, so 2 buses. So we factored that cost in as well. And we already have identified the students that we know would have to be bused. So they would then be bused over to the Levy building and be bused home.
Okay.
Okay, so I have a couple more questions about the, what you're asking us to approve and what the other borrowing phases have, how the other borrowing phases have gone, as I wasn't here when you proposed those and when those were approved. So
Okay.
just as a kind of accountability mechanism, like the other borrowing phases, what happened, and in terms of the work that was proposed and what the work that was completed.
Okay. So for the first, and by the way, I'm Suzanne Slack, Chief Financial Officer for the school district. For the first borrowing, we had 4 schools included. It was Bellevue Elementary, Fraser, which is a K-8, Ed Smith, which is a K-8, and Grant Middle School. All of those are close to completion, so for construction to be completed, we have to go through the final punch list, go through a state filing process with a final claim report, and then it's considered actually done. But all 4 of those, the children are back and the schools are occupied and up and running. Ed Smith moved back in over the October holiday weekend, and Bellevue opened right at the beginning of the school year. So that was approximately $77 million for that initial borrowing. And then with our second borrowing that we did, we borrowed money for the Fowler Roof project. So Fowler High School had been renovated several years ago in JSCB Phase 1. There was not sufficient funding to complete the roof project, so we did that. Then Huntington, K-8 school. And then we also borrowed money for Syracuse STEM at Blodgett. At the time, it was Westside Academy at Blodgett. So the renovations are continuing at Syracuse STEM at Blodgett, and Huntington, again, like the others, is near completion.
I'm sorry, which one is near completion?
Huntington.
Okay. You have questions about
The dates of the first versus the second borrowing, were they like a year apart, or were they closer than that?
Good question. I can get that for you. I don't have that with me, I don't think.
Just because I kind of think of Huntington as on a similar timeline as
Might be.
Grant, so I don't
Do
understand.
you know the answer to that? The dates that we did the first and second borrowings? Oh, you know what? Actually, I might have it with me. Okay, so the very first borrowing was June of 2016, and the second borrowing was June of 2018. So then we had our third borrowing, which was completed in August of 2017, and that was for Corcoran High School, Nottingham High School, Bellevue, well, a little bit on Bellevue, Ed Smith, and Syracuse Summit Blodgett. Each of those projects, we increased by $1 million earlier in the year, so we had to borrow the funds for the completion of those projects. So it was primarily Corcoran and Nottingham, both of which were underway over this last school year and this summer. So those schools are still under renovation, will continue for another two summers.
2 summers.
Did you mean August of 2019? Because you said the first was June 2016, the second was June 2018, and then you said the third was August 2017. But that seems like the second.
Oh, that's when the financial plan was done. Let's see. It was May of 2019. I apologize. The financial plan was done in 2017. And so this next borrowing that we have that we're considering, again, is for Clary Danforth Elms, the fields and the interior work at Fowler and Henniger High School. We anticipate the borrowing closing at the end of January and being complete the first few weeks of February.
Could you say that one more time?
We anticipate the borrowing closing at the end of January and being completed the first week of February.
Okay.
And when we conduct the long-term borrowing, it actually will pay off the short-term borrowing that we took out earlier last year. So when we do the short-term bond anticipation notes, we close those out with the long-term borrowing, pay that off, and then push everything into one debt issuance.
So the Phase 1 borrowing, those schools are occupied, those renovations are those renovations are complete in every sense, or there's still filings that need to be done with regard to?
There are still filings, there's still
Phase 1?
final punch list, things like that, yes.
Okay, and Phase 2, the work is not complete at any of those schools in terms of the actual renovations happening, and they're not complete in terms of filing?
So Bellevue and Ed Smith are near completion, but Corcoran and Nottingham will go on for another 2 summers.
Is that the third borrowing?
That's from tranche 2 borrowing. I thought that's what you referenced.
So I referenced the second, the second borrowing, which
Okay.
you described as the Fowler Roof, Huntington, and Blodgett.
Yes.
Those are near completed, but not yet.
I think the problem is the first, second, third, and
Roof
fourth
of
don't
Fowler is
align with the way
Yes.
they talk about the tranche. So they're all, are they?
They are not all near complete. Blodgett is
They're
not.
all tranche 2. All these first borrowing, second borrowing, third borrowing, fourth borrowing were all for
Phase 2,
JSCB phase 2.
Yeah, but tranche 1 has 1A, 1B, which I misunderstood when you said tranche 2.
on A.
I've never heard you here today use the phrase 1A or 1B.
I didn't, I apologize. There's 4 borrowings, 1A, 1B,
There we go.
2A, and 2B.
And we're on 2B now. So
Yes.
the number 4 when we were going through
Yes.
is really 2B, which matches the title on the sheet.
Yeah. Just trying to make it a little more accessible, I think, because it's confusing when we use different tags, right?
Absolutely. I apologize for that.
Any questions, Joe?
No.
Oh, okay.
Reading loudly.
How is this this managed from the school district perspective? How with 4 different 4 different
Borrowings?
borrowings. I mean,
Okay.
that's not a real word, but that's the word you use. Okay.
People understand that.
So 4 different borrowings. How is this managed from the perspective of the school district versus JSCB? And can you delineate who's managing these projects? With 4 incomplete stages, different borrowings, how is this managed from a school district perspective?
I think it's helpful to understand some of the constraints when you issue debt for construction projects. When you borrow money for a construction project, there's rules in place to protect the bondholders. And you have to spend the money within a certain schedule, or those bonds are at risk of being considered taxable, which would have implications to the district as well as to the bondholder. So initially, when we thought we could do one big borrowing and start all these projects at once, we had not taken into consideration that some of the projects might not start right away, they would start later. And that staggered start would result in us not meeting those deadlines. So essentially you have 3 years to spend the money, but there are targets along the way. And if you miss those targets, the penalties are not only the tax penalties, but there's arbitrage. If you've borrowed money, you're earning interest on it, and that exceeds the interest you're paying on the debt, which you have a risk of doing that if you're not spending the money on a regular basis. If you're sitting on the money longer, you'd earn more interest. So I think initially when we thought about doing the borrowing, we thought that we could manage all of that, and quickly realized once Turner was on board that we couldn't do that. We wouldn't be able to meet those target payment dates. So initially we thought about breaking it into 2 borrowings and doing 7 projects in the first phase, 7 in the second. And it got a little more complicated with some of the issues at the Fowler Stadium site.
Mm-hmm.
So at that time, we phased the construction so that it would be manageable from 2 perspectives. There'd only be so much construction in the marketplace at once, and we could align it to the debt payment requirements that we have. And that's how we ended up with the 4 different payment structures. As projects are closing out, although it is a fair amount of work to close out a construction project, resources become more available in the marketplace. So as we go to bid now for these upcoming projects, there should be more, all else being equal, there should be more folks available to work on construction projects. So we think that we will get favorable bids for each of these projects and be able to start the construction in those as the other projects close down or continue in their 2nd or 3rd year.
Why would there be more construction? I understand that once construction company A is done with one project, they're free for project number 2 or 3 or 4. But are you saying there are more construction? There's more capacity in the construction field now than there was at the beginning for some other market reason?
No, I'm saying all else being equal, if we're finished with a group of projects, those folks would be more likely to be available to start on a new project.
Okay. Any other counselors have questions?
Yeah,
Sorry, I'm monopolizing a lot of dumb questions. Thank you.
that's fine. I know one of the biggest challenges with all these projects is just getting qualified bidders that are willing to do it at, for a price that works. And I know that these projects are very challenging by their nature, and that's one of the things that can scare off potential bidders. I'm just curious if you guys have any feedback on potential changes that would make it more palatable for potential bidders. If there's anything out there that, as a city, we should be looking at to make it a more robust, competitive bid process.
I think we would kind of defer to Chris Gray from Turner Construction. That's his field of expertise, and Chris can probably talk more on that.
How are you?
Good.
So,
Just identify yourself, where you're from.
I'm sorry?
Just identify yourself for the.
Sure.
YouTube
Chris Gray with
viewers.
Turner Construction. We're the program manager providing program management services for the program. So, I don't have a single one for you. It's probably a culmination of several things. The project, I would tell you, is administratively intense with respect to some of the requirements of the project. You've got several components to it that make it different than the typical K-12 work that you would have. You have a PLA involved in the project. You've got a diversity plan involved that brings with that requirements. And you have the normal traditional components of a K-12 work in terms of trying to do a tremendous amount of work in a short period of time during the summer. When you put those together, it definitely is a different type of construction, and administratively is much more intense than some other work of its similar nature, say in a West Jenny or one of the other rural districts that doesn't have a lot of the requirements that we're seeing here.
Okay.
To answer your question.
What are the other requirements besides the diversity that make it difficult? They have to get the work done in the summer too?
We have a PLA in place.
Project labor agreement.
Can you explain how?
Project labor agreement, and the compilation of work in Syracuse is a mix of both what we call open shop and union contractors, and so sometimes there's a PLA there that may not be attractive to some of the workforce because they're not used to working with the requirements of the PLA.
And that's not typical for an out
It's
of
not
city-
typical for K-12 work in the upstate New York market. It's not been the typical for me in the years that I've been operating here to have one of those in place. So it's not atypical to have a PLA on a public project. I just want to be clear. That's not atypical for a public project to have a PLA. In the K-12 market, it's a bit different. So it exists elsewhere in some of the other big five. That this is not unique, but it is nonetheless it is a factor. Does that answer your question? Thank you.
Yeah, I just have just questions relative to projects at Corcoran and Nottingham. I've seen the work that's being done at Nottingham, and I'm assuming that at Corcoran we're only talking about portions of a project.
Correct.
And so at Corcoran, I know that there was concern. We toured the building. I don't know if you guys were there, maybe a year or so ago. It's still called the B building?
Yes.
The basement by the gym? I don't, is that the area that's under construction now?
We have various parts, but right now they're working in the A building with window replacement. They're actually cutting windows into the building,
Wow.
which
Okay.
has
I'm
never
jealous.
happened before.
Right.
We're improving the mechanical structure. We're improving the lighting. We've redesigned the library. And then I believe we're moving over to the B building next summer. So next summer, there's work planned for the B building.
I know that I believe on the schedule, this is relative to their football fields, Corcoran and Nottingham both need repairs. Now, those are not included in this.
They're not included in this, but it's something that we've talked about as a district, that that field is in need of replacement.
Yeah, because I think I was told that Corcoran was, I guess, where he was next on the list, and then Nottingham was after that.
Yes. We've gotten our
But
money's
no-
worth out of Corcoran's. It's the average lifespan of a turf field is 10 to 12 years,
right.
and I believe that's been in existence for about 15.
But no scheduled date for those, right? No.
No schedule. It's a part of the capital project that Mr. Farrar, our director of facilities, has submitted to the district and to the city.
All right.
In a case like that where the liability is, you said 10 to 15 years, 10 years for the football field, but we're beyond that. So is there if something happens, if a person is injured on the field, like, do we have any liability because we failed to repair within that time frame?
There's not a liability. In fact, what it is, fields typically last a certain amount of time. You can get more life out of it depending on the use and the weather conditions. Corcoran has held up relatively well. We do yearly maintenance on those fields, so we're stretching out as long as we can. But we are certainly, it's on our radar to have that field replaced.
Is it? Yeah. So to understand what Councilor Allen referred to earlier in terms of the kids moving from Clary to Levy, is this part of a long-term plan to keep buildings that are not currently in use to be available as swing spaces? Or is this a temporary fix to this temporary problem?
I think that's a good question that probably predates when most of you were here. As enrollment didn't keep pace over the years and enrollment in the district wasn't increasing, we made choices to close schools. 9 times out of 10, it starts with a financial need to close a building and save money. So we had closed Elmwood, we had closed Levy, we had closed Shea and a few other schools. So as those schools sat vacant, we would use them from time to time for a variety of reasons, but having them available as swing space for other construction projects really helps with the construction to go faster, and they can go in and do a complete renovation in a building without doing parts at a time like we spoke about at Corcoran. So there's a benefit to having that option if those buildings aren't being used otherwise. Every year when we put together the budget, we reevaluate and project enrollment to see if we do think we're going to need to reopen a school that was previously closed. This year we have a very odd spike in 6th grade. That may end up requiring an additional middle school for a period of time or maybe indefinitely as we see an increase in children moving into this area in those grade levels. And as they age out, that kind of follows through. So you might see an expansion at high school in terms of enrollment over the next several years. So we really make those decisions on the buildings and what to do with them based on enrollment and what we think the needs will be over the next few years. But when those buildings are available, we certainly do try to use them for swing space if we can.
And from a construction standpoint, it makes the job more favorable for a contractor to bid on because it's an unoccupied building. The contractors can work first shift versus second shift, which typically will cost them more money.
Because when I first heard Levy, at least naturally what comes to my mind is, why not Elmwood?
Elmwood is occupied right now.
It's occupied.
So,
Yes.
Yes.
gotcha. Okay.
Yep.
What was that? Elmwood's occupied by who?
Oasis.
Okay.
Consider that like full occupancy because it's relatively empty, right?
Well, we have our Oasis program in there. We also have some of our special ed programs housed in there, and we have a teacher program called PAR. Those people have offices housed in that building as well. We did have adult ed in there until October, so they were in there as well.
Does the district notice attendance or other enrollment differences when using a swing school? For example, I certainly Ed Smith, many of those families were disappointed to be moving to Levy and not to be back in at the beginning of the year. Do you notice when there is a need to use a swing school because a school is being renovated that you see any differences in either kids even being enrolled at that school as kindergartners or pre-K, whatever the beginning grade is, or in coming to school every day? Obviously, you're not going to have walkers to Levy for kids who are, or maybe there might be few, there might be some who are walkers to Levy who wouldn't have been walkers at Clary, but those kids who are currently walking to Clary aren't going to be walking to Levy. Do you notice any differences in that?
No, not really. The attendance really did not falter at all when we swing into a new school. And those students that were walkers at one school now are able to get transportation to their new school, and then when they move back, they revert back to being a walker.
I'm interested. 'Cause anecdotally, I've heard that families who would have been eligible for Ed Smith, but their kids would have started at Levy. They weren't interested in having their kids start at Levy. So that may have,
For kindergarten?
for kids who would have been starting school, their very first school experience
Okay.
would have been at Ed Smith, but for it being moved to Levy. So I'm interested. Doesn't have any
Our
significant blip.
kindergarten enrollment last year was up a little bit. I don't remember a dip at Ed Smith, but I could take a look. It wasn't significant because it doesn't stick out.
Interesting. Okay. I haven't heard any other questions. Anyone else?
I just see this as an opportunity to touch base since we don't always connect. So whenever you come to borrow money or to need our approval to borrow the money, I think it's good for us to touch base. But as we move forward through these JSCB Phase 2 and on to whatever next, how do we, I know we've talked about Tom, when he's here, we'll talk about the building allocations and getting like a double allocation for schools in the future. For instance, I think that's what we're trying to do with this team school, trying to get more money to do a more comprehensive renovation with the commitment idea that you're not going to go back to that school as quickly. So, and we haven't gotten those double allocations in the past as a district while other cities have. So as we move forward in future JSCB, however it looks, are there like things you're learning about how we should do it differently? Like, are we going to move toward double allocations as a standard? What does that mean for swing space? Like, I imagine if you're going to do a double allocation, you're going to need more swing space because you're going to be less able to do the Huntington thing where you just do the renovate. Like, if Huntington had been a double allocation, I think it probably would have made more sense to close it and do it for a year and put them somewhere else, but then you need the space for them to go. And even right now, Levy seems like the best swing space we have, but then is it going to be empty the rest of the year, or will Clary move in? Like, there's because the efficiency of being able to use the swing space too. Like, if we need the first month of school for the school that didn't finish, then we lose like the opportunity of a year of a different school being in there. So I'm just trying to think from big picture, because I don't want to micromanage everything you do, and you have people to do that, and you have a board and all this other stuff. But just big picture, like, how are we doing this? How does it make sense? What are we learning? What are you thinking about for how we might do it differently? And what are the things we should be thinking about as we move forward?
I think your first question about the double MCA is a state legislative decision.
Right.
That's really out of our hands. We can request from the state for the maximum. The MCA is the maximum cost allowance, what the state will allow us in aid for an individual building. And what the counselor is referring to is if every 5 years you can go to the state and ask for an allotment for renovation. If they doubled that amount, you in essence could do a double renovation in a shorter period of time, and it really would expedite things. However, the state has been reluctant to provide that to the Syracuse City School District. So we have in essence had to do partial renovations in some of our schools. And that is sometimes disruptive to the learning environment, and it would be ideal to take a school like Huntington, renovate the entire building, have the children in an alternative spot, and then come back. The piece about a swing space, which having some gaps, which I think is ideal, is that if those constructions come into delays like we ran into with Ed Smith, we had the opportunity to leave the children at Ed Smith in Levy until October while the new Ed Smith, or old Ed Smith, was completed, and then we were able to move them back over a long holiday weekend. So it gave us some flexibility, so children didn't have to move into a building that still had pieces of construction that needed to be done. So having some gaps, I believe, is advantageous to the district and to the students.
So if we were to switch strategy, like let's say, so the STEAM school, I think, is trying to get the double allocation, the double MCA.
Correct.
So is that done in a way that it's a one-off, or is that done in a way that it systematically changes the option for us?
It's project by project.
It's always project by project?
Yes.
Every other place that's done it, it's always? So
I
we would
believe
have,
Rochester's JSCB asked for it globally, and so instead of doing, say, 10 projects, they said, we'll scale back and only do 5 if we can get double MCA on those. But the legislation is specific project by project. So you can ask for a lump like that, but it would be approved one by one.
do you have any reaction to the viability of asking for lumps more often, the double MCA? And really, because I could see how it would change the overall strategy, right? I think you may need more swings. If all 4 projects you're going to do require swing space, then that's different than 6 where half don't have swing
Right.
space.
And we don't have, I don't think, the capacity to swing a high school. There's nowhere else that I can think of we could put all the kids from Henniger or Nottingham or Corcoran for a year or 2 while we worked on their buildings. So it really depends also on the number of kids. And maybe in a K-8 school, you swing out the elementary and leave the middle school kids there and then flip-flop or something. But I think that we've learned a lot from all the projects that we've done. Phase 2 is tremendously smoother than Phase 1 was. I think Phase 3 will continue that trend. And the double MC, I just want to clarify, you don't get twice as much money. You just get it all up front, and then you can't borrow or ask for it for 10 years instead of 5. So it sounds like you're doubling your money, but you're really just advancing money from the next 5-year allotment. So we certainly will ask for that and be thoughtful about what projects does it make sense on.
When you say it's not double, is it just some present value adjustment that the state gives you? Like when you win the lottery, you don't really win the face value. There's a calculation they pay you. Is it like that, or is it like how much less than double is
I have
it?
not thought of that analogy. So just for number's sake, let's say that the maximum cost allowance in a high school is $30 million for 5 years. If you get permission to double it, you'll get $60 million, but then you can't go back to the state again for 10 years.
Right.
But you don't
That sounds like
you don't
double
get
to me.
56 million.
Yeah, they
is
don't
what you're
do,
saying.
I don't think the state does present value.
Yeah.
Could be wrong, but I don't
Right.
think so.
So you're getting double.
Yeah.
2 times.
So it makes sense to double it up anytime you can. For the most part, we haven't, like anecdotally, I would say it seems more problematic. I don't know, maybe I can't tell if Ed Smith or Huntington is more undesirable. Like, do you want the kids going in at Huntington when it's still being under construction and didn't get everything done that should have been done? Or is it worse to be Ed Smith where you do close, but then you're actually closed for the first month of the next school year too, or whatever the school year when you were supposed to open? So I don't know if there's a clear takeaway, but I feel like my suspicion is it's probably better to close them in terms of like the effectiveness of every dollar spent. Like I think it would be easier for the contractors to come in and just do it. And if they're just doing it, then I would say have them do the whole school and not have to come back 5 years later. Especially because the cost, if the state's going to give you the double today, the cost of the construction is going to be more 5 years from now. So it's not really.
So when we put forth, I apologize, the Phase 2 legislation initially, double MCA wasn't an option. It kind of came into play subsequent to that. Rochester's received it, and Yonkers has gotten permission. They haven't executed anything yet, but they've gotten permission. So certainly they know that in Phase 3, Syracuse is going to ask for that option. And I think we would be strategic. So if there's a building, let's say Henniger, we've already done 5 years worth of MCA, we probably don't need to ask for double for Henniger. But maybe for a different building we would. So we would be strategic about which facilities we ask for that.
In some buildings, you might need additional funding, and if you're stretching that out over 10 years and you encounter an additional problem, then we don't have resources to go to.
I note that Councilor Green came in, and I don't think I noted that earlier. So, any other questions? We appreciate your time and being here and answering our questions, some of mine being very basic. But I think for the purpose of making this more accessible, for reference, we have in a committee meeting in a half an hour about $48,000 increase of expense, and we're talking about $108 million here. So I thought it deserved some attention and some clarity for folks who are watching their pennies at home. $48,000 and $108 million, and the attention that we devote to both is important.
I agree.
So
Thank
we
you.
appreciate your being here.